How can the deliberate act of building up someone else's position, making it as strong as possible, actually make your own critical thinking fundamentally stronger and more resilient?
That is really the essential insight driving our exploration today. Our mission is to unpack the principles, the processes, and importantly, the ethical obligations behind what's known as steel manning. It's basically the rhetorical opposite of that familiar and frankly often lazy straw man fallacy. We'll be digging into key insights from your source materials, which provide a pretty comprehensive guide to how this practice of charitable argumentation fosters accuracy, empathy, and maybe most importantly, trust in dialogue, especially when the stakes are high. The material covers quite a bit from the philosophical roots right through to a structured five-step process and, of course, practical applications.
Okay, let's unpack this term then, this practice of steel manning. It's defined right at the start as the deliberate attempt to restate another's position in its absolute strongest, most charitable form before you even think about offering a critique. Which, I mean, that sounds almost radically counterintuitive in modern debate, doesn't it? The goal often seems to be finding the weakest semantic point or, the most emotionally charged phrase to jump on immediately.
Yeah, that's the common reflex. But what's fascinating here is that while the term steelman feels very contemporary, the idea itself, it's old. The conceptual roots run deep right into Western philosophy. This idea has a powerful foundation in what philosophers call the principle of charity. This principle, formalized by thinkers like Donald Davidson back in '73, it governs how we interpret what people say. It basically asks us to assume, first off, that the other speaker is rational. So when their argument seems flawed, the principle of charity encourages interpreters to reconstruct that argument in its most rational, coherent, and plausible form before judging it as wrong or illogical. You sort of assume they meant to be logical, even if the words came out a bit messy.
That initial assumption, presuming rationality, that's a huge mental hurdle for a lot of people, especially in a heated moment, right? But here's where it gets really interesting for me. The sources point out how the idea moved from just interpretation into a practical, conversational ethic through people like Dennett. He offered what I think is maybe the ultimate standard for charitable debate in his rules for criticizing. Dennett's rule basically says when you state your opponent's view, you should present it so persuasively, so clearly, and so accurately that when they hear your summary, they actually respond with genuine gratitude.
Gratitude. I mean, that is an incredibly high bar. Gratitude from your opponent. It really forces the person listening and restating to move past just hearing the words and into understanding the underlying motivation, the premises, the intended strength of the argument. Dennett really shifts the practice from a passive intellectual thing to an active demonstration of respect.
Right. And while those philosophical and ethical roots sort of lay the groundwork for intellectual honesty, the sources note the term steelman itself was popularized much more recently. Often credited to the writer Scott Alexander, maybe around 2014, he framed it explicitly as the inverse, the opposite of the ubiquitous straw man. He was really urging people to consciously build up rather than instantly caricature or, dismantle their opponent's points. This feels like it moves the practice decisively from, say, the philosophy department into being a practical tool for better public and private conversations.
And to truly engage in steel manning with real sincerity, we also need to connect it to a very related and arguably prerequisite concept, the ideological Turing test, or ITT. This was proposed by the economist Brian Kaplan back in 2011, and the ITT basically gives us a way to measure true empathetic understanding. The test requires you to articulate an opposing position so convincingly that you could actually pass as a genuine high-fidelity advocate of that position.
Whoa. So it's not just listing their points. You have to internalize their worldview, their emotional commitments, the logical framework they're using. You have to write or speak for the opposing view so well that someone who actually holds that view would think you're one of them. That's a massive ask. How does that skill connect directly to the steelman process then?
Well, it's the training ground for sincerity, isn't it? If you can't genuinely articulate the best version of their view from the inside, how can you claim to be steel manning it fairly? If we connect this to the bigger picture, these traditions, charity, steel manning, ITT, they form this comprehensive bedrock for charitable dialogue. The principle of charity is the theoretical underpinning. It guides that initial good faith interpretation. The steelman is the active method of reconstructing and strengthening based on that interpretation. And the ideological Turing test. That's the ultimate check on your fidelity and empathetic understanding, the thing you need to perform the steelman ethically. If you can't pass the ITT for a particular view, your attempt to steelman is probably just going to reflect your own biases back at you, not their strongest case.
Okay, so for the learner listening, the person who wants to actually apply this immediately, the sources provide a clear, structured process. It's definitely more than just a mindset, right? It's presented as a rigorous 5-step cycle. It emphasizes both analytical accuracy and communicative charity, which makes it sound like a repeatable skill, not just, something you do if you're feeling nice.
Right. This 5-step framework is really key for turning the ideal into something you can actually practice. Step 1 is foundational. It's active listening, restatement. This means you articulate the other person's argument, their core claim, their reasons, maybe even their unstated assumptions, but entirely in your own words. You're listening, processing, and then reflecting it back clearly.
Okay, restate in my own words. Then comes the steel part. Step 2 is strengthening. This sounds like the really hard bit.
It is where a lot of the intellectual work happens, yes. Strengthening means you actively engage your critical thinking on their behalf. You look for assumptions that might be implied but weren't actually said out loud. You fill in missing premises, maybe, to make the argument logically sound, or you just supply the most rational, robust interpretation possible. This is especially important if the speaker stated their case, in a rush or emotionally, or maybe just didn't structure it very well. You're giving them the maximum charitable benefit of the doubt their idea can logically support.
Giving them the benefit of the doubt, but strengthening.
Yes, and this strengthening step is where a lot of ethical pressure comes in. You have to walk a fine line. You're clarifying and improving the logic and structure of their position, and this is crucial, you can't introduce new evidence or premises they themselves would reject. So, for example, if someone argues against a policy based on, say, economic inefficiency, strengthening means finding the best economic data or model that supports their claim. It does not mean suddenly bringing in a moral argument about human rights that they never even hinted at.
Ah, okay. That's a really important distinction. You maximize their intent. You don't invent a whole new, better argument for them.
Right.
But then we get to step 3, and this seems maybe the most crucial one, ethically and practically, verification. You have to check back.
Yes, you absolutely must seek confirmation from the original speaker. This is the moment where your good faith becomes visible, tangible. You have to explicitly ask something like, okay, is this an accurate summary of the strongest version of your argument? Or maybe, is this interpretation really getting at what you meant to convey?
And why is that check back, that verification, so essential? Why not just assume your strengthened version is good enough?
Well, the sources really hammer this point home. Without confirmation, your beautifully crafted steelman risks becoming just an idealization. You might inadvertently create this, logically perfect argument that the original speaker thinks is interesting, but it's not actually what they meant or what they believe. You'd then be critiquing this amazing but ultimately irrelevant phantom of their position. Verification ensures that when you do finally offer your response, it's aimed at the position they actually hold, refined, and agreed upon by both of you.
I see the intellectual benefit there, definitely. But I have to push back a bit on the practical side. Like, in a fast-paced business meeting or a really tense negotiation, doesn't pausing the whole thing for, 3 or 4 steps? Restatement, strengthening, verification, acknowledgement, doesn't they just, kill the momentum? Doesn't it signal weakness or give the other side too much time to regroup?
That's a fair question. It addresses the timing and context. But the sources suggest that true, meaningful engagement requires this pause. And far from signaling weakness, the act of precisely restating and verifying, it actually signals confidence, intellectual integrity. Think about it from the perspective of the person being steelmanned. When they hear their own position articulated, maybe even better than they manage themselves, they feel respected, heard. And that demonstration of respect dramatically lowers their defensiveness.
Okay.
It makes them much more willing to listen to whatever you say next, including your critique. In high-stakes situations, clarity and trust are often way more valuable than just, tactical momentum.
Okay, I can see that. Investing in clarity pays off by lowering the walls. Makes sense. And once you get that confirmation, you move to step 4, acknowledgement, just a brief recognition.
Yeah, just a simple acknowledgement. It's a moment of intellectual humility, really. Recognizing the shared effort you both put into getting clear. Something like, okay, got it, thanks for confirming.
And only then, after all that groundwork, after restating, strengthening, verifying, acknowledging, only then do you get to step 5, response.
That's the discipline. The entire practice of steelmanning, and what makes it genuinely difficult is that required delay. You have to hold back your own points until the foundation of mutual understanding is absolutely solid. It forces intellectual patience.
Right. Okay. If you're finding this deep dive into civil, rigorous dialogue helpful, Please do take a moment to like, subscribe, and maybe ring the bell so you don't miss our future explorations into how we can all think and communicate a bit better.
So circling back to our original teaser question about how this makes your thinking stronger, let's focus on the rewards. When you practice this properly, steelmanning offers really substantial payoffs. They go way beyond just, winning an argument. The first major benefit is simply improved accuracy. By actively seeking out and then verifying the strongest version of someone else's argument, you naturally minimize the distortions and misrepresentations that just plague so many discussions, especially heated ones. You stop wasting time arguing about a misunderstanding.
Yeah, and that accuracy feeds directly into the second benefit, trust building. Confirming another's views, especially a view you plan to disagree with, that increases psychological safety. It lines up really well with the work of someone like Jürgen Habermas, who argued back in the 80s that for real societal cooperation, what do you call communicative action, you need this shared assumption of good faith and rationality. Steelmanning is like the practical demonstration of that good faith. When I feel safe and heard, I'm way less likely to just shut down or react defensively. It makes the conversation potentially productive.
And the third reward, perhaps the deepest one and the real answer to our teaser, is how it enhances your own critical thinking. This is that idea of intellectual inoculation. When you actively and sincerely grapple with the strongest possible version of an opposing view, you're essentially stress testing your own position against its toughest counter. Think about it. If you can only defeat a sloppy, weak version of an argument, the straw man in your own position is probably pretty fragile, right? It's vulnerable to any sophisticated critique. But if your argument can successfully address or counter the best, most compelling steelman version of the opposition, then you know your own position is robust. It fundamentally reduces that intellectual complacency. You've basically inoculated your belief system against its most potent rational threats.
That is a profound benefit. Wow. It turns the whole argument process inward, forcing a kind of self-critique fueled by the best external challenge. The sources also emphasize the role of steelmanning in conflict reduction. In settings like negotiation or mediation, referencing principles from works like Getting to Guess, reframing arguments charitably can really de-escalate tension. How does that work exactly?
It works because the focus shifts. It moves away from positional threats like I demand X and you demand Y towards understanding the mutual interests that both parties have confirmed through the process. This promotes collaborative problem solving. How can we meet both our underlying needs, rather than just competitive haggling over demands?
Okay, the benefits are clear. Accuracy, trust, stronger thinking, less conflict. But you mentioned hazards. This technique isn't foolproof, right? Misuses can undermine the whole thing.
Oh, absolutely. Like any powerful tool, it can be misused, and that can actually lead to greater distrust than if you just argued conventionally.
So let's talk about those risks. The first one mentioned is over-idealization. Can you walk us through how a well-intentioned steelman might go wrong by being, too perfect?
Right. Over-idealization happens when the argument you reconstruct is so elegant, so polished, maybe it fixes internal contradictions the speaker hadn't resolved, that the original speaker genuinely doesn't recognize it as their own. Imagine maybe a scientist struggling to articulate a new hypothesis that still has some significant data gaps. A very charitable listener might fill in those gaps with plausible but completely unverified information to create this beautiful, complete hypothesis. When they go to verify, the original scientist might say, well, I wish that was my argument. That sounds great, but honestly, I don't have that key data point yet. You've accidentally created this sort of idealized phantom. The speaker feels misunderstood, not because you didn't listen, but because you tried too hard to make them smarter than they are, so to speak. It basically invalidates the verification step.
Okay, so trying too hard to fix it can backfire. Then there's the really corrosive hazard, weaponization, using the process purely for rhetorical advantage. How does that play out?
Weaponization is particularly insidious because it mimics sincerity so well. An opponent might go through the motions restatement, strengthening with great rhetorical flair. They build up your argument beautifully, but they do it only to then knock it down with overwhelming, brutal force. It makes their eventual critique seem utterly decisive. The underlying intent isn't mutual understanding at all. It's to set up this dramatic intellectual takedown, maybe to humiliate or just dominate the conversation. An observer might be impressed by the logical display, but the person being steelmanned, they feel completely manipulated. It shatters the trust it's supposed to build.
Well, yeah, that sounds awful. And the final risk mentioned is performative use. This feels very relevant for, public discourse, social media, maybe.
That's right. Performative use is simply using the language of steelmanning, saying things like, okay, let me try to restate your position fairly, but only as a rhetorical flourish. It's for show. They aren't making a sincere attempt to actually internalize and understand the other perspective. They might go through the steps superficially to look fair and balanced to an audience, but they aren't really listening to refine their understanding, and they don't genuinely seek verification or care if they get it. It's like checking a box for appearing reasonable, rather than engaging in rigorous, honest thought.
Right. These risks really underscore that sincerity is non-negotiable here. The ethical heart of this practice is treating others as rational people who deserve to have their views understood accurately, not just as, obstacles to overcome or weak points to exploit, no matter how cleverly.
So, where can we actually use this tool effectively? The sources are clear that its relevance goes way beyond just academic debates or online arguments. This is presented as a fundamental communication and critical thinking skill.
Yeah, the sources point to critical applications in political dialogue, for example. Instead of immediately jumping to the usual caricature of the opponent's platform, using steelmanning could be essential for bridging those huge ideological divides, accurately articulating the best version of the other side's platform before you critique the policy details. Misunderstanding just fuels gridlock, right? But charitable clarity could actually fuel compromise, or at least productive disagreement.
It's equally vital in business and negotiation. Imagine walking into a negotiation and starting by demonstrating you genuinely understand the other stakeholders' core needs, their constraints, their perspective, before you even mention your own proposal. That shows powerful respect. It can shift the whole dynamic from a rigid positional fight where everyone just defends their initial ask to a more collaborative, interest-based negotiation. You start looking for ways to meet everyone's underlying motives.
And we definitely shouldn't forget personal conversations. These are often the most emotionally charged, aren't they? In family arguments, relationship disputes. The ability to just pause and restate someone's concerns in a fair, empathetic way. Okay, so what I hear you saying is that can be key to strengthening the relationship itself. It helps people feel genuinely heard, which lowers that natural defensiveness that just triggers escalating fights.
It's also helpful, I think, to place steelmanning among other related techniques we sometimes hear about. We've already drawn the main contrast. The straw man is all about distortion. You create a weakened, easy-to-knock-down version of the argument, like framing a proposal for gradual emissions reduction as, they want to ban all cars tomorrow and destroy the economy. It's designed purely to be dismissed out of hand.
Right, whereas the steelman, as you said, is about charity and accuracy. It reframes that same idea, maybe as, quote, they're proposing a multi-decade transition plan, using specific graduated restrictions on certain vehicles, aiming to meet internationally agreed emissions targets while minimizing economic shock.
Right.
That immediately shifts the conversation to policy details and feasibility.
Now compare that to the devil's advocate. Playing devil's advocate is a technique used mainly for exploration. You argue for a position you don't personally hold, maybe just to rigorously test an idea's weaknesses or explore its limits, often in a brainstorming session or a low-stakes internal discussion. Steelman, though, is fundamentally different. It's focused on charity and accuracy and understanding and representing what the other person actually holds. It validates their position, making it stronger, not exploring a hypothetical one.
And, as we discussed earlier, the ideological Turing test, ITT, is different again. It's really an empathy test at its core. It requires that performance of belief, like writing an op-ed from the other side's perspective convincingly. So the ITT is like the underlying skill, the foundation that helps ensure you have the genuine charitable intent needed to do steelmanning well. ITT builds the internal muscle. Steelman provides the external method.
And to truly master techniques like steelmanning and the ideological Turing test, it really does require consistent, structured practice and, crucially, a willingness to confront your own biases. We strongly encourage you, if you're interested in this, to take the free Street Epistemology course available over at navigatingbeliefs.com. It's a great way to build these crucial, critical thinking muscles.
Okay, let's try to bring this down to earth even more with some specific examples provided in our source material. These really show how shifting the frame can completely elevate a discussion and clarify what the actual disagreement is about. This is where the theory becomes practical.
Let's look at the political sphere again, which, let's be honest, is often ground zero for terrible communication habits. The simple, often outrage-inducing straw man is something like, they just want open borders, no security, just let everyone flood in. It's designed for that immediate emotional dismissal, right? It completely avoids any real policy discussion.
Yeah, you hear versions of that all the time. But applying the strengthening and clarification steps How does the steelman version sound?
Well, the steelman construction becomes much more nuanced, more focused on the policy trade-offs. They argue that a modernized, perhaps more open immigration system could substantially enhance economic vitality and cultural diversity, provided that security vetting processes are simultaneously optimized for speed and effectiveness rather than serving primarily as a tool for volume restriction. See how this version acknowledges the potential benefits they see economic vitality while explicitly integrating the need for safeguards? It frames it as a legitimate policy discussion about how to balance those competing interests.
Okay, that's a much more complex and debatable point. What about a scientific example? Like climate modeling, where things get heated fast.
Right. The common caricature you often hear is, oh, climate skeptics are just denying settled science because they're paid by oil companies, or they're just ideologues. This dismisses any potential scientific points they might raise.
So the steelman version has to engage with the substance of the skepticism.
Precisely. A steelman reconstruction would be far more detailed and focused on the specific points of scientific disagreement. Okay, a segment of scientists skeptical of the mainstream consensus argues that while the climate is warming, current predictive models might be overstating the rate or magnitude of future warming. They point to specific uncertainties, perhaps related to water vapor feedback mechanisms or the complex modeling of cloud formation, which they believe could lead to potentially inflated long-term projections. Now, the debate isn't about belief or denial. It's about specific data sensitivities, model parameters, the physics of feedback loops. It becomes a much more productive, detailed scientific discussion, even if you ultimately disagree with their interpretation of the uncertainties.
That makes sense. It forces the conversation onto the actual science. And does this work even at the really small scale? Like in those personal arguments that cause so much grief?
Oh, definitely. Those might be where it's most needed. Think about a common frustrating scenario. Maybe a spouse or a friend says, totally exasperated, you just don't care about my schedule at all. You always just do whatever you want. The immediate defensive reaction is usually to list counterexamples, right?
But the steelman approach forces empathy. How would that sound?
Well, it transforms the focus. Instead of a global attack on your character, it focuses the complaint on the impact of a specific behavior. The restatement might become something like, okay, let me make sure I understand. You're saying that when I don't check in with you about timing before I commit to something, it feels like I'm disregarding your commitments, and that makes you feel unsupported or unimportant. Is that capturing it? That verified restatement focuses the discussion on a concrete process, the act of checking in, which allows for a practical, constructive solution. Okay, I can make a better effort to check in first. It avoids a pointless fight about the abstract concept of whether you care or not.
That feels much more solvable. So ultimately, this approach isn't just a clever debate trick. The sources emphasize it carries real ethical weight.
Yes, significantly so. Fair representation, trying to understand someone accurately, it honors their intellectual agency. It embodies virtues like honesty and intellectual humility. It reinforces that fundamental idea that we should treat others as rational conversational partners, worthy of being understood, even, and maybe especially, when we profoundly disagree with their conclusions.
And crucially, the sources seem pretty optimistic that this is a teachable skill. You can actually get better at this with practice.
They strongly suggest it is. You can build this muscle. The methods mentioned include things like dedicated dialogue drills. These are structured exercises where people practice restating an opponent's view over and over until they get that clear, unequivocal affirmation. Yes, that's it. You've got it. The focus is on repetition until accurate restatement becomes almost reflexive.
Okay, drills. What else?
Reflection prompts are also useful. These force that internal check-in, that critical self-assessment, pausing mid-conversation or afterwards and asking yourself honestly, did I represent their argument as well as they would have? Or did I just represent a version that was easy for me to shoot down? That forces you to confront your own potential biases.
Right, that internal work.
Yes. Structured workshop exercises where groups explicitly practice the full 5-step steelmanning process in sequence. Restatement, strengthening, verification, acknowledgement, and then response. They aren't allowed to offer any critique until they've successfully navigated the first 4 steps. This really cultivates the discipline and the patience needed for charitable argumentation to become, hopefully, second nature. So, To sort of wrap up, we've explored how steelmanning, this process of reconstructing arguments charitably in their strongest form, promotes trust, improves accuracy, and really drives deeper understanding on both sides. It offers a clear, structured path towards dialogue that can be both more civil and more intellectually rigorous, but only if, and this is the big if, only if it's practiced with genuine sincerity and consistently validated by that crucial verification step.
We started off by asking how the act of building up an opponent's argument could possibly strengthen your own thinking. And we learned the answer really lies in that concept of intellectual inoculation, testing your own beliefs against the absolute strongest possible resistance you can find or construct. Now, we want to leave you, the listener, with this final, maybe provocative thought. Think about a recent, perhaps frustrating disagreement you had, maybe one that keeps coming up. If you were to go back and rigorously apply this 5-step process, really delaying your response until you had accurately restated, strengthened, and verified their position, how might the outcome have changed? What key assumption, maybe something left unsaid by either of you, would you have needed to clarify and bring out into the open? We invite you to start a conversation down in the comments section below. Share your thoughts maybe on when that verification step feels the hardest in the steelmanning process. Is it because of time pressure? Or maybe sometimes is it because you genuinely fear that the verified, strengthened argument might actually expose a real weakness in your own position? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.